So it's now 2 days since Americans really went to the polls to vote in the country's presidential election, but no clear winner has emerged, at least just yet. Democratic Party candidate Joe Biden is leading in the electoral college votes, but it's still too close to call. For the first time, mail-in ballot votes has shattered all previous records, with almost 100 million votes sent through the mail. Let's bring in our analyst. Sanusha Naidu is a foreign policy analyst at the Institute for Global Dialogue. She believes the American voting system might be going through an institutional crisis of its own. Also joining us for this conversation, this time live from Atlanta in the United States, is Alethea Bonello. She's a program manager at the African American Center for Global Politics and Human Rights. To the both of our guests, thanks very much for making time for us. Alethea, good evening to you. Sanusha, good morning to you from South Africa. Once again, great to have both of you on. Let me begin in the United States, in Atlanta. Alethea, the Electoral College in its current form is being viewed now by many people as a system that works to suppress the popular vote and, more importantly, to suppress the voice of minority voters. To what extent do you think that's accurate?
Well, I certainly believe that the Electoral College has had its time and it's gone, and there needs to be a revision of how we ultimately choose the President of the United States. As Vice President Joe Biden talked about, we the people, as it's written in our Constitution, we should be able to choose who the President and Vice President of the United States should be, as we do with all the other down ballot candidates in offices and positions, all the way down to the local level. And so a reform is certainly necessary for the Electoral College.
And how much of an inconvenience, for lack of a better term, would that be? I mean, the perception that's always given is, an overhaul of something like an electoral system gives more cost than there are benefits, but I'm wondering whether or not that's just, again, another way of ostensibly keeping these systems in place for the interests of certain political leanings, for lack of a better term.
Indeed. Something like the Electoral College, however, I think that is a barrier, but a very simple barrier that can be eliminated. It certainly wouldn't affect what would take place. We would have already known that Joseph Biden and Harris would have won the popular vote by over 50%, and it wouldn't be necessary to wonder about these electoral votes that have to be attributed and who gets to 270. So that conversation would be eliminated immediately, and we would receive faster results on election night.
Right, certainly. Sanusha, let me bring you into this conversation. I've struggled multiple times trying to explain to fellow South Africans how the Electoral College works. Perhaps let's take a few steps back. Is there a South African, call it, arrangement that closely resembles the Electoral College, and how would you explain exactly why it's problematic?
Good morning, Ayanda. Good evening to the guest in Atlanta. It's quite so. I mean, it's not easy to explain. It took me a few times to even get my head around the methodology of why it exists. And like my colleague rightly says, it's an antiquated institution that needs to basically be resolved, needs to either be decided to do away with or whatever. In the context of South Africa, let me put it to you this way, and I don't think we would have had a chance in the negotiations to even consider something like an electoral college into the system. What we did in South Africa was we created the sunset clause. The sunset clause was essentially one that enabled the former National Party to have some kind of protection of their civil service, their bureaucracy, and enable that bureaucracy and civil service to have 10-year, well, in some cases 10-year of protection, but in other cases an early exit voluntary package. And I think that's was to try and see how you bring in the integration of the old bureaucracy into the new bureaucracy and going forward. It's not the same system. It's not in the same caliber as the Electoral College. But I think in the context of South Africa, that idea of not having a majoritarian vote or the popular vote, at the end of the day, you decide who's going to be the president, who's going to be the ruling party. Again, we don't have the system that's clear. It is flawed. We vote. It's proportional representation. We vote for a party. That party decides who the president and vice president of the country would be. And of course, again, that's another dilemma for us, is that we're trying to get more to that direct participation of a popular vote. But I guess it's not as complicated as in the US, because my sense is that when I go out to cast my ballot, I'm voting for either Mr. Biden or whoever else. I'm not waiting for then the people at the Electoral College to make a decision around whether my vote is a legitimate vote for Mr. Biden. I think that for me becomes a complication, because then it unravels the entire institutional architecture of what democracy is in terms of by the people, for the people, of the people.
Yeah. It's very easy, though, to have these conversations and I guess view them through a particular lens. I remember, I think it must have been Frantz Fanon who wrote about the pitfalls of democracy. You know, the system in its, call it golden standard, does have a few aspects that leave a lot to be desired. Let me go back to the United States. Alethea, how do we tear apart the electoral college system, so to speak, but also ensure that we don't replace it with aspects of democracy that themselves are problematic, including the fact that democracy, according to some people, is dictatorship by the majority in some respects?
Well, of course, interestingly enough, the founding fathers created the Electoral College because they did not have faith in the American people. And so they created this layer that would allow the states to vote and elect these electors to come together in December to actually officially cast the vote for the president and vice president of the United States, theoretically that they could actually change their minds. And so in order to dismantle this, I would believe it would take a constitutional amendment that they would want to abolish it. Whether or not it will happen, if this is going to be a threat to the powers that be and those who are in power, then more than likely they are going to put their own barriers to block it itself. So it's a conversation that we've been having for many years, and it seems with each passing presidential election, the voices become stronger. Do we really need the Electoral College, and what is an alternative?
Right. And who do you think stands to benefit the most from the Electoral College in its current form?
Well, I believe that the smaller states have the opportunity to have a greater voice in the presidential elections, because every vote does count and every electoral vote counts. And so within the popular vote, as we see that Hillary Clinton won almost 3 million more votes, but she still lost the presidency. And that seems a bit odd, but it's because of the Electoral College itself and the fact that there is more weight at times to the smaller states than to the larger states that has a denser population. And it seems that it's packed. And all those additional votes aren't really, don't have the same strength or significance as it does in the other states.
I don't want to take this for granted. Why is it problematic that smaller states, which in the absence of this arrangement would be overrun almost every year, so to speak, why is it problematic that there's something that almost enhances their voice and their say? I imagine this is what most people are thinking. The principle, dare I say, appears noble.
Indeed, it is. It is mirrored actually off of the Congress. So there are 538 votes. It mirrors the 538 representatives in Congress plus 3 votes for DC. So it does mirror what they wanted to do to offset population versus states that had lesser population. However, as I said, when you have states that have more people, but because it's oversaturated, once they get to a certain level and they win, those additional votes don't really matter in the election as much as those in the smaller states have a greater percentage. It is noble. It is something that we do want to allow smaller states to have some type of say, an equal say as the larger states do. But now it seems that it's no longer effective. As we said, when you have over 3 million voters, they said that they wanted one candidate, and yet because of this current structure, another candidate was able to win with less votes. Then we have to look at a better system.
Yeah. Sanusha, let me bring you back into the conversation. Part of the story around voting is obviously reading the demographics, so to speak. Of course, votes are still trickling in, but pictures are starting to emerge. It turns out, contrary to what many people might have thought, populations, including the Latino voter, for instance, in the US, didn't necessarily resonate with someone like Joe Biden. This is in spite the xenophobic undertones of Trump's campaign. I wonder if something like, changing the voting system will help us better capture things like that, moments where, we need to take cognizance of how demographics specifically are voting.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the run-up to the election, the American election is always a fascinating affair because there's so many polls and so many media exit polls that tend to look at different constituencies, different electoral profiles, different group profiles and community profiles. And I think in this election, it was quite interesting where, again, analysts in the US had said they didn't get the pollsters didn't get it right. The pollsters kind of fell short in the way that they defined whatever the variables and the factors were that they used in order to carry out their projections, didn't get it right. And I think there were questions around who came out to vote, but more importantly, did Mr. Trump get more votes this time around than he did in 2016? And if he did, who were those voters that came out to vote? And then if you cross-reference that with the argument that did Biden do enough to basically get into those uncertain, undecided voters who were basically on the day or wherever going to say, I'm going to the polls, I'm not really sure what I'm going to do, but I'm going to vote. Did Mr. Biden capture that vote or did Mr. Trump capture that vote? Coming to the question of the Latino vote, I think there are bigger structural and institutional issues to be raised there. I know Florida was one of those key states. Somebody mentioning in one of the news agencies that if you win Florida, it's your ticket into the White House. Now this is going to be an interesting election because it looks like, and you can't tell now because in the last time we did this around the U.S. election, everybody got it wrong. Everybody hung their head in shame. But the thing about this is that is it enough to say that if Mr. Trump wins Florida, which has a big Hispanic Cuban community there, and of course and he's got Texas again, Hispanic Mexican community there. Is he going to be in the White House? Because those are the two big swing states for the candidates. I'm not sure anymore because it seems to me, coming back to the point that Alethea is making about the role of smaller states, why the electoral colleges were created in order to have that kind of balance in the smaller states represented in the Senate. I think this time around, those smaller states are maybe playing an interesting, if not significant role for Mr. Biden. So, he still has to get Pennsylvania, but I think Philadelphia and Pennsylvania is going to be a key issue for him. We know there's a dispute happening in Wisconsin. I don't know how you dispute the account because it hasn't been officially audited yet. So there's another question here that makes me wonder. But I think coming to the Hispanic vote, coming to the different minority votes in the U.S., I think when you go out and you talk to the electorate, do you talk to them based on the fact that you're talking to what they want you to talk about? Or is it possible that Mr. Biden spoke more about things that were much more broader, whereas Mr. Trump may have spoken about issues that attacked Mr. Biden's personality, which made this undecided voter scared in the Hispanic community. I mean, I would think that if I come from a migrant or an immigrant family and I've lived under socialism in a particular country, and then I see a candidate contending for the White House presidency and says to me, you're going to go back to the times of that kind of economic socialism, I would be a bit concerned. And I think playing to that dynamic, playing to those theatrics, playing to that kind of fear tactic and that kind of electoral process was perhaps what Mr. Trump did very well and got the Hispanic vote into the space. Maybe not, maybe in the following election, which is what I hear as well, is that with younger people born in the U.S. of Hispanic or Latino heritage, etc., may not be that sympathetic to a man called Mr. Trump or any of his family coming to contest the election next time around, or anybody of that nature or caliber. But I think it was quite close in Texas. So again, the question is, it's the same thing in South Africa, Yanda. We talk about the apathetic voter. We talk about the undecided voter. But I think at the same time, we're not sure whether our political parties, and they have in the US there's 2, in Alethea in South Africa we've just got 48 now. We're just making it quite a multi-party democracy. And I think to a large extent in South Africa there is a lot of uncertainty amongst voters as we go into next year's local government election, where we are going to go through the same issues. People are apathetic. Are they going to go out to vote? Who are they going to vote for?
Yeah.
There's no trust in any of the political parties.
Sure, yeah. It's an interesting conversation, one that's becoming all too common every 4 years in the US and possibly here in South Africa. Sadly, that's where we're going to have to leave it, though. Certainly appreciate your insights. Alethea Bonello is a Director of Programs for the African American Center for Global Politics, joining us live from Atlanta in the United States. And Sanusha Naidu, you might be familiar with. She's a foreign policy analyst with the Institute for Global Dialogue. To the both of you, thanks very much indeed for your time.